A recurring theme of this season has been that of the superpowers intervening in the affairs of smaller countries, whether in Europe, Asia, Latin America, or Africa. This episode, we'll see how an intervention by the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a decade-long war against US-backed rebels with over 1 million dead and 7 million refugees. A country that had shown some promise would remain a failed state for decades to come, suffering years of civil war, terror, and severe human rights abuses long after the occupying power left. The fallout from the conflict would have political repercussions that would be the cause of many of the world's wars and tragedies in the early 21st century. That conflict is the Soviet-Afghan War. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to Battlefields. Since even before the time of Alexander the Great, the empires of the world have sought to control Afghanistan. Rich in culture and natural beauty, this mountainous country occupies a strategic position between the Middle East, Central Asia, and India. In the 19th century, Afghanistan was at the center of the Great Game between the British and Russian empires, and Afghanistan finally gained its full independence in 1919. The Kingdom of Afghanistan was neutral during World War II and the Cold War, though both the United States and Soviet Union tried to woo the Afghans by financing infrastructure and building projects within the country. In the 1960s, King Mohammad Zahir Shah began to modernize and implemented a number of democratic reforms, such as free elections and equal political rights for all Afghan citizens. But in 1973, while he was abroad in Italy, his first cousin, former Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan, staged a coup. Daoud became the first president of the new Republic of Afghanistan. During Daoud's tenure as Prime Minister and as President, women's rights improved. Afghanistan sought relationships with the outside world, and the economy experienced substantial growth. He did, however, face criticism from some ethnic minorities for his emphasis on Pashtun nationalism. His presidency was also marked by authoritarianism and restrictions on civil liberties, which left many on the political left disillusioned, as did his growing ties with the Shah of Iran and the West. On the other side of the political spectrum, and as a foreshadowing of things to come, emerging Islamist groups opposed his modernist reforms. Following the assassination of left-wing politician Mir Akbar Khyber on April 17, 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, supported by Moscow, led a coup on April 27th in which Daoud and his family were killed. The new government, led by Nur Muhammad Taraki and dominated by a PDPA faction known as the Khalq, embarked on a radical program for reforms. They promoted equality between the sexes, encouraging the education of girls and bringing women into the political sphere. But a campaign for land reform, which limited the amount of land a family could own, proved ill-advised. Harvest outputs were reduced, and there was considerable backlash among the rural population. The government responded to any counter-revolutionary activity with brutality, imprisoning and executing opposition. As you may imagine, revolts sprang up across the country. In March 1979, an uprising in Herat left thousands of people dead, and it was followed by mutinies in Jalalabad, Ghazni, and even Kabul. Now, Afghanistan and the Soviet Union had signed a treaty in December 1978, which allowed the PDPA to call on Soviet military support. Realizing that the Afghan army was overwhelmed, Taraki repeatedly requested assistance from the USSR, which reluctantly provided him with military equipment and advisors. To make matters worse, in the midst of the emerging chaos, a power struggle within the PDPA led to yet another coup on September 14th, with Taraki arrested and killed under the orders of fellow Khalqist Hafzullah Amin. Amin would be in power for little more than 3 months, during which the anarchy in the country only increased. Executions continued, and relations with the USSR deteriorated. The Soviets aligned with the much more moderate Parcham faction of the PDPA and finally decided to take control of the situation themselves. On Christmas Day 1979, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Afghanistan with 80,000 troops. Airborne forces occupied Kabul, while ground forces entered the country from the north. Amin sought refuge in Tajbeg Palace, still believing the Soviets were on his side, right up to the moment they had him surrounded. Following a firefight with heavy casualties, Amin was arrested, tried, and executed. International condemnation for the invasion was swift. 34 Muslim nations adopted a resolution demanding Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and a similar resolution was passed by the UN General Assembly. But while the Soviets successfully occupied most of the main urban centers and lines of communication in the country, their intervention did not pacify Afghanistan. On the contrary, the disparate rebel groups and local warlords were now united in their stand against an atheist foreign invader. Fighting a holy war, they became known as the Mujahideen and got material and financial support from countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Turkey, and even China. Muslims from a number of different countries went to Afghanistan to join the holy war, most famously a young Saudi from a rich family by the name of Osama bin Laden. Knowing the massive advantages the Soviet army had, the Mujahideen engaged them in guerrilla war. The Soviets responded with a number of offensives. Between 1980 and 1985, they fought a series of battles in the strategic Panjshir Valley against a group of Mujahideen under Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had established a stronghold there. Concerted attacks by the Soviets would succeed in driving the rebels out, but they would always return as soon as the Soviets moved away. This pattern was repeated throughout the country. In the east, near the border to Pakistan, the Mujahideen cut off access to the strategic airfield at Khost from the rest of Afghanistan. The siege of that city would last more than 8 years. In general, the war was becoming a stalemate. The Soviet strategy of search and destroy missions combined with secret police operations did achieve some successes, but did not pacify the country in the long run. And the Mujahideen were successfully able to recruit new members despite heavy losses. In 1986, the USA provided the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, with which they could more easily shoot down Soviet planes. The effect these had is controversial. While Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, the mastermind of the operation, maintained that it helped the Mujahideen to turn the tide of the war, British author Jonathan Steele maintains that it just made the Soviets change their emphasis to night raids, and that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was already made in 1985. In any case, by 1987, Soviet presence in the country was heavily reduced, in accordance with Mikhail Gorbachev's new foreign policy. Ultimately, the Geneva Accords of April 1988 laid out a one-year timeline for Soviet withdrawal. By February 1989, the last Russian troops had left the country. The new Soviet-backed government in Kabul under Mohammad Najibullah would not last long. Despite officially making Afghanistan an Islamic state in 1990 and removing references to communism from the constitution, the war against the Mujahideen continued. And the government was even able to win a battle against the Mujahideen without direct Soviet help at Jalalabad. But when the USSR collapsed in December 1991, the Afghan government lost support, and many of its remaining supporters defected to the Mujahideen. In April 1992, Kabul fell to a force commanded by Ahmad Shah Massoud. As we all know, Afghanistan's troubles were far from over, with factional violence among the Mujahideen leading to yet another civil war, which ended with the rise of the Taliban in 1996. Ahmad Shah Massoud, who still controlled the north of the country, would be assassinated on September 9, 2001, 2 days before the 9/11 attacks, which would trigger the war on terror and bring the Afghan conflict to its latest stage. The decades of war have left Afghanistan one of the poorest and least developed nations in the world. A third of the population was either killed or fled during the Soviet occupation, and landmines have left many people with permanent disabilities. Comparing photographs taken in Kabul during the 1970s with those taken today feels like looking at two completely different worlds. Afghanistan is just one example of a series of countries who suffered under Cold War proxy wars. Another big example is, of course, Vietnam. We made an episode about the Tet Offensive, which was a major turning point of the war. You can check that out right here. So, that was the last episode of Cold War Battlefields. Next season, we'll be looking at the history of China. In the meantime, think about these questions. How do you think things would have turned out had the Soviet Union not intervened? Was Afghanistan always destined to suffer from poverty and civil war, or could things have turned out differently? Would Islamism have emerged as such a powerful force in the world if there hadn't been a Soviet-Afghan war? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.